Shanghai or Tokyo? What is the better place to live as an expat? And indeed, what's the cheaper place to live as an expat? That's going to be the topic of today's video. Now, many of my followers and readers have told me to do more cost of living articles and indeed videos. So I'm going to compare two major cities that I've lived in the last 10 years, Shanghai and Tokyo. Now, obviously we don't have time to go through everything, but I'm just going to talk about the main things. Now, first of all, in terms of cost of living, it very much depends on where you live and your lifestyle, of course, but I'm going to generalize here and say this. If you live on the outskirts of Shanghai, in other words, outside the major kind of built up areas like around Nanjing Road and those kind of places, and you're willing to localize your taste, like use local websites to shop around for rent and whatever, you can live much more cheaply in Shanghai than you can in Tokyo. I know several people who don't live in central Shanghai. They live like an hour away by subway, and the rents can literally be a fifth or a seventh even of the price of something in central Shanghai, but they are living in localized kind of accommodation. In comparison, I know some people in central Shanghai paying $3,000 for rent. They could get the same place for say $300 in a outskirts place, which is still connected to the main Shanghai subway. So Shanghai does have more of a cheaper area than Tokyo, although Tokyo, just like Shanghai, it is much cheaper when you go into the suburbs, but it's not anywhere near as cheap. In other words, if you live in Chiba or Kawasaki and you kind of commute in by the subway to central Tokyo, you know, you might be spending $70, $80, $90,000 on rent, which is between $700 and $900 a month, whereas in the outskirts of Shanghai, you can do it much cheaper than that. However, when it comes to central Shanghai and central Tokyo, I think that's where things are much more even. Not for everything. I think anything like from the supermarket or convenience shops is probably cheaper in Shanghai, but and also accommodation is probably ever so slightly, maybe literally a little bit cheaper. Taxis and subways and whatever, metros or whatever you want to call it, are much cheaper in Shanghai too. But overall, I would say if you're living in central Shanghai, you can pay maybe 10 or 15% less than you would in central Tokyo, but it's comparable for sure. However, it does depend on your income and lifestyle, because one thing that people forget about China is that taxes are very, very high in mainland China. Now, it gets complicated. It depends what kind of income, of course, you've got. Is it capital gains? Is it locally sourced income, and so on? And yes, it is true to say that there are plenty of Chinese people and plenty of foreigners living in mainland China. They've got income sourced outside of China, but they don't actually tell the government, which is never a good idea. However, in general, China is a very high tax country. So is Japan. However, what a lot of people don't realize about Japan is when it comes to foreigners living in Japan, as per KPMG and our analysis of this, it is possible to legally live in Japan in certain situations on foreign income and pay zero for the first few years. In other words, let's say you're, I don't know, a retiree, or you're married to a Japanese person and you are living on overseas sourced income. In many situations, you don't have to actually pay tax on that for the first 4 or 5 years that you live in Japan. Or it gets complicated, right? It depends on many things, but in general, there are ways as a foreigner you can reduce your taxes in Japan. Whereas in China, regardless of where the money is coming from, the UK, US, China, outside of mainland China, Hong Kong and Macau, you should technically, I think, pay exactly the same tax. Whereas if you live in Japan as an expat, and say your employer pays you partially in Japan, partially outside, there are ways you can reduce it down and actually even live pretty much tax-free for at least the first few years. Now, Japan's not like Malaysia or Singapore or Thailand. They're called territorial tax countries. So in those kind of countries, you can live as a retiree or indeed a digital nomad for decades sometimes and pay no tax, provided that your income is sourced overseas. Now, again, it depends on many things. There are many caveats to that. But Japan isn't that liberal, but it is true to say you can live for a few years tax-free as an expat, or most kind of expats in Japan. Now, in terms of the best places to live, it depends obviously on your hobbies and so on. I think the biggest negative about China is, at the end of the day, it is a one-party state, right? So when it comes to freedoms and communication, you don't actually realize until you leave China for a few years and then come back to visit that indirectly it affects everything in your life. It's not just a case of like Facebook or YouTube or things like that, but even the way people might think or the way people communicate. But in addition to that, things like, okay, let's say if I want to go on, I don't know, CNN.com, Guardian.com. Not that I'm saying I would, but just as an example. Even though those websites are not blocked in China, it slows down the internet connection compared to a local website. Likewise, if you're a business person and you want to do calls, for example, it can be very difficult to do Skype calls, WhatsApp calls, even WeChat calls. Sometimes they cut off a little bit. So when it comes to the internet, it isn't just Facebook and YouTube and the likes. Actually, the internet gets slowed down quite a lot. Whenever you use a foreign website, even if that foreign website is not blocked, that can actually cause a lot of issues. I can remember the last time I was in Shanghai, I had a client who signed up for an investment. So I needed to log into the portal to kind of log the details. And the portal is not blocked by the Chinese authority, but this is no exaggeration. It took me about 10 attempts to actually manage to do it, because basically it was too slow, because the internet was slowed down and this website takes a lot of bandwidth. And when I speak to any international business people who are based in China, they all say the same thing. If you're calling from a Chinese landline or Chinese mobile to another Chinese mobile, fine, no problem. If you're on the internet, Chinese websites, no problem. But let's say you've got customers all around the world, and indeed you want to go on websites, even if they're not banned in China, then you start to get issues. So I found that from a productivity point of view, to do what I do and have clients all around the world, it's much more difficult when you don't have a free and quick internet. In the same way, if I lived in some extremely poor country, let's say a country that doesn't have good infrastructure when it comes to Wi-Fi and 4G, 5G, I wouldn't be able to do what I do currently. So when it comes to anyone who relies on a really good internet connection, Japan, Korea, outside of mainland China, including Hong Kong, even Malaysia, Thailand, much better for those kind of things. But Shanghai is, I would say, easily the best city to live as an expat in the mainland. But the biggest negative is the internet connections, which is kind of linked to the political issue. And also things like visas and things like that. In Japan, you have to bear in mind, if you're an expat and you lose your job, you own the visa. In China, the employer owns the visa, similar to the UAE. So if your employer wants to sack you or even makes you redundant because of COVID or bad economic issues, staying in China long term gets a bit more difficult. So also bear in mind, when it comes to things like regulations, regardless of whether it's the internet regulations, visa regulations, the fact the law favors local people for sure in many situations in business means that Japan, ironically, which is often seen as a protectionist country, or was historically, is much more open these days than China. This might shock you, but I've lived in so many countries around the world, and I actually found getting a work visa for Japan was actually far easier than China. Maybe that's because of the decline in population, but I think it's a bit of an outdated idea now that Japan is just kind of closed to the outside world. It's partially true compared to Singapore or even Malaysia, Thailand, maybe to a certain extent, but I think China is much more closed in some ways. In other ways, it's not. And one thing I would say about China is the business culture. There's so many good things about it. Things are speedy, things are quick. There's an entrepreneurial zeal you'll find, especially in Shenzhen, but also Shanghai, whereas Japan's much more conservative. You won't learn as much in business in Japan as you will in China, I think, in most industries. But overall, I would say Japan's a better place to live than China, certainly outside of Shanghai. Shanghai to Tokyo, I have to say, if the political system was different, Shanghai would be maybe my favorite, if not second or third favorite place in the world. It reminds me of a dry British joke. One of my British friends says, "Oh, I love America. There's only one problem with America. It's all the Americans." And obviously he's joking, right? He doesn't hate Americans. It's just a bit of a joke. But really the bottom line is Shanghai would be a great place. just if the CCP weren't in power. And that's the reality, right? All the bad things about Shanghai have nothing to do with necessarily the people or the food or things like that. It's all things kind of linked to politics, like the internet and all those kind of things.